The half-closed door. Minh Chau stood under the sweeping archway of the Le family mansion, the afternoon sun warming her back as the ornate iron gates inched closed behind her. Her heart pounded with anticipation and unease in equal measure. She clutched her suitcase a little tighter, not out of fear, but as if it were the last link to a freer life she was leaving behind. The air inside the mansion felt heavy, every breath tinged with a subtle, expensive scent. Old sandalwood, polished marble, fresh lilies imprudently arranged in vases too grand for any ordinary home. Golden light filtered through stained glass windows, scattering pale, distorted rainbows across the checkered foyer floor. Yet, despite these signs of opulence, the atmosphere wrapped around Chau like a too-tight winter coat, elegant but stifling. At the end of the hallway, awaiting her arrival, were members of her husband's family. Each stood at measured distance from one another, their expressions composed and unsmiling, almost as if performing a practiced ritual rather than greeting a new family member. Her mother-in-law, Madame Le, appraised Chau with eyes both sharp and calculating, lips pressed into a line faintly resembling a smile. Mr. Le, a quiet shadow to his dominating wife, nodded with detached formality. The sisters-in-law observed Chau in silence. Their impeccable attire and perfect posture, an unspoken declaration of hierarchy. As introductions faded, Chau became acutely aware of the remarkable lack of warmth. Conversation, though polite, was laced with an undercurrent of skepticism. Questions about her education, her parents, even her diet fell from their lips, gentle in tone but probing in intent. It was clear. She was both guest and subject, closely monitored in these hallowed halls. A subtle unease began to grow in Chau's mind. There was something about the house, its endless corridors, the hush that fell too soon after her arrival, the way servants scurried almost invisibly through discreet side passages. Portraits of stern ancestors hung high on the walls, their oil-painted gazes forever critical. Sometimes, when Chau walked past the grand piano or paused at a sunlit window, she sensed she was being watched by more than just the living. That night, Chau unpacked in her room. A high-ceilinged chamber with silk drapes, a cold marble floor, and a balcony overlooking manicured gardens. The walls seemed to close in as she struggled to breathe, weighed down by the silence and the memory of her family's modest but affectionate home. She wandered quietly through the mansion's maze, fingertips trailing across furniture that gleamed, but spoke of decades of secrets. In the library, her eye caught a locked drawer below the shelves, its ornate keyhole polished from generations of use. She heard hushed voices down the servants' hallways, words clipped short when someone passed. At dinner, she noticed a seat at the table conspicuously empty. And the rest of Mav, the family never mentioning it. All of these small details, minor on their own, wove together into something she could not quite name. Suspicion? Fear? Some buried truth that haunted these walls? Before sleep finally claimed Chau, she sat by her window, gazing into the moonlit gardens. Questions swirled through her mind. What had she truly stepped into? And why did it feel as if, behind every half-closed door, someone, or something, was intent on keeping the past hidden at any cost? The gates had shut behind her, but in the Lee family mansion, far more dangerous doors stood barely ajar, waiting for the right moment to reveal their secrets. Veiled existence. From the first light of dawn, Minh Chau's days in the Le mansion unfolded according to rituals that felt both ancient and unyielding. The household woke early, its rhythm dictated by unspoken rules and tightly held expectations. Servants moved swiftly but silently, attending to tasks with mechanical precision, their eyes lowered, whenever a family member passed. Chau quickly realized that even her simplest actions, a greeting in the corridor, her choice of attire for breakfast, the way she addressed the staff, were noticed, remarked upon in hushed tones, then reported with unsettling efficiency. Mornings began with formal meals, during which Chau sat among the impeccably dressed women of the house. Her mother-in-law, Madame Le, presided over the table like a queen, every word uttered with calm authority. The young wives, Chau's sisters-in-law, exchanged polite conversation but rarely spoke beyond the superficial. Their glances held hidden meanings, a hint of challenge, a flash of pity, sometimes a cold satisfaction when Chau faltered on a detail about family tradition or etiquette. Even the clink of porcelain cups seemed weighted with judgment. Chau's husband rarely intervened, buried in business or absent on trips, leaving her alone to navigate the household's labyrinth of customs. She soon noticed that decisions about her own children, what they wore, when they studied, whom they could befriend, were swept into the current of Madame Lee's commands. Any hint of resistance was met with an icy smile or a veiled warning cloaked in concern for the family's reputation. Tensions simmered just below the surface. On one occasion, a minor disagreement about household spending turned into a subtle confrontation at lunch. Madame Le asked a servant, within earshot of everyone, to recalculate Chau's monthly expenses. Her tone gentle, but her implication unmistakable. Another day, one sister-in-law delivered a pointed remark about outsiders, never truly understanding what it means to uphold family honor. Her voice cloaked in sweetness, but her intent sharp as a knife. Yet despite being hemmed in on all sides, Chau refused to let the walls close in completely. She found quiet rebellion in small, daily choices, encouraging her children to read stories from her own childhood, teaching them songs that reminded her of happier places, asking probing questions about family routines that the other women had ceased to notice years ago. Still, she was careful, measuring every word and gesture. The pressure grew heavier as Chau realized that her privacy was a fiction. A misplaced letter or an unsanctioned phone call inevitably brought a polite but firm reminder from her mother-in-law about keeping personal matters within the family. At times, Chau felt as if her every move was being recorded and played back to a council of unseen judges. The moments of brief solace came mostly at night. When the house finally quieted, she retreated to her children's rooms, lingering over homework and bedtime stories, savoring their laughter before the mansion's formality descended again each morning. She spoke to them in gentle tones, instilling seeds of independence, reminding herself that her strength would be the only protection they had against a world that valued silence over truth and conformity over spirit. But the cost of balancing this double life, of appearing submissive while nurturing her own will, weighed on Chau's soul. She learned to mask her worries behind serene smiles, to deflect criticism with polite deference, and to listen more than she spoke. Each day demanded a delicate dance, never showing too much of her own opinions, never openly challenging the unspoken rules, but always quietly watching, always learning how power truly shifted behind these grand walls. With every passing week, the patterns of concealed control and hierarchy within the Lei family became clearer to Chau. Underneath the polished surface, beneath the velvet drapes and golden chandeliers, the daily existence of each member was a performance, a careful balancing act of image and obedience. And as Chau adapted, she realized that navigating this world would require not only patience and intelligence, but the courage to be herself, even if that self had to remain, for now, cautiously hidden behind a veil. The first clues. Days turned into weeks, and Minh Chau, though outwardly conforming to the Lee family's rituals, could not quiet the restless curiosity building steadily within her. The mansion that once seemed only oppressive now appeared layered with secrets, each corridor and shadowed alcove whispering stories she was never meant to hear. Her intuition, honed by years of navigating fraught dynamics and unspoken rules, told her there was more to this place than its meticulously maintained facade. One windy afternoon, as the household bustled preparing for an important family ceremony, Chau found herself momentarily alone in her late father-in-law's study. The room was rarely used, shrouded in somber tones and flooded with the faint scent of old paper and cigar smoke. Intriguing, then, was the sight of dust on every surface except, curiously, for the carved wooden desk. There, beneath a stack of yellowed business ledgers, she noticed an envelope poking out, its seal broken and edges worn as if frequently handled. Inside the envelope, she discovered a faded photograph. 3 men standing shoulder to shoulder in front of an unfamiliar building. One of the men was unmistakably her father-in-law, much younger and almost smiling. The other men bore an uncanny resemblance to people she had glimpsed only in the oldest portraits of the house, though no one had ever spoken of them to her. The back of the photo was marked with a single cryptic word in red ink: debt. As she slipped the photo back into place, footsteps echoed in the hallway. Chau's heart leapt. Instinctively, she feigned interest in a nearby stack of books as a servant hurried past, eyes averted. The brush with discovery stoked her sense of danger and excitement. Who were the other men? What debt bound them together? And why had her father-in-law hidden this memento in a room seldom entered by anyone but him? Throughout the following days, Chau listened more attentively to the hushed conversations among the staff. Once, while passing the kitchen door, she overheard a maid murmur, "If only the thing buried in the garden had never seen the light of day." The words were clipped short when the head housekeeper appeared, and silence fell like a shroud. Another time, a gardener's slip of the tongue, "What happened that year should have stayed forgotten," was quickly drowned out by the roar of the lawnmower. Emboldened, Chau began to nurture cautious alliances with 2 staff members. Mrs. Lin, the gentle, aging housekeeper, and Tuan, a reserved but observant driver who had witnessed much during his decades of service. With careful phrasing and a disarming smile, she dropped subtle questions, queries about the family's history, about rooms in the mansion that no one seemed to use, about names from the past that caused discomfort whenever mentioned. Mrs. Lin, though wary, confirmed that there were stories too painful to tell, but she urged Chau to focus on her present happiness and not chase shadows. But for Chau, the shadows only grew more distinct. A missing page from a household ledger, a name hastily scribbled and then crossed out. Rumors of a violent storm years ago when a part of the estate was reportedly destroyed. None of these were concrete answers, but each clue, however minor, felt like a fraying thread waiting to be pulled. One late evening, alone in the dim light of the corridor, Chau passed the grand family portrait in the foyer. Under the glass, she noticed, perhaps for the first time, a faint scratch across the painted face of one of the old men, aligning exactly with one of the strangers in the photograph she'd found. It was as if someone had deliberately tried to erase part of the man's place in the family. Restless, Chau returned to her room, her mind buzzing with questions and uneasy excitement. The fragments she had gathered, murmurs, lost, names, dusty tokens, were singularly innocent. Yet together, they hinted at something deeper, more dangerous. Somewhere in the heart of the mansion, a story was woven with pain and silence, waiting for the right pair of eyes and the right moment to be fully uncovered. And for the first time since she'd arrived, Minh Chau saw her fear begin to intertwine with a sense of purpose. The first clues had emerged from the mansion's shadows, and she knew she could not, would not, let them go. Sleepless night of inquisition. That evening, an icy rain blurred the vast glass panes of the Le Mansion, casting shifting shadows across its grand halls. Minh Chau should have found comfort in the warmth of her room or the proximity of her children asleep down the corridor, but the discoveries of the past week throbbed in her mind. She had become a reluctant detective, trapped in a labyrinth whose walls were fashioned from secrets and silence. Outside, thunder growled, a low, continuous warning. Inside, the family dined in tightly coiled silence, each member masking their private thoughts behind careful manners. Chau sat at the shining mahogany table, quietly observing. Madame Lee's questions were fewer tonight, her eyes sharper. There was no mention of the rain-spattered letter Chau had earlier seen in the hall, nor inquiry as to why she had disappeared longer than usual that afternoon. But the air was thick with suspicion, and Chau sensed she was being watched even more closely. After dessert, as the family dispersed, Chau lingered, pretending to organize her children's homework in the study. Every now and then, a servant would appear soundlessly, their gaze flicking with sympathy or warning. She couldn't always tell which. Mrs. Lin, the gentle housekeeper, paused at the doorway, her face lined with worry. "You should rest, madam. The house is not itself these days," she whispered and slipped away before Chau could reply. Instead of resting, Chau's curiosity burned hotter. The patient, careful puzzle-solving of the last few days had only led to more questions with sharper edges. She was determined, tonight, to find answers. The letter she had glimpsed earlier, addressed in a rushed, unfamiliar hand, was nowhere to be seen now. The study, too, was locked. Someone was moving pieces on the chessboard, defending ground she had never intended to storm so openly. As the mansion settled into nighttime hush, Chau tiptoed through lamplit corridors, careful not to let her footsteps creak on the inlaid floors. She paused by the ancestral shrine, its incense lingering from the evening's offerings. Beneath the watchful eyes of stern ancestors, she tried to piece together everything she had learned so far. The photograph hidden in the study, the cryptic word debt, the servant's slip about something buried in the garden, the scratch on the portrait in the foyer. She made her way to the library, hoping that in the quiet hours, she could revisit the locked drawer that had evaded her before. As she reached for the handle, a sudden voice cut through the silence. "Looking for something, Chau?" It was Trin, her sister-in-law. Trin's tone was smooth as silk, but there was a glint of accusation in her eyes. Chau summoned a polite smile. "Just searching for a book to help the children with their lessons." Shaken but undeterred, Chau stayed only long enough to retrieve her composure. As she crept back towards her room, snippets of conversation drifted from Madame Lay's closed parlor. Her name spoken with concern, words cloaked in euphemism. Fit in, behave, family expectations. The realization struck hard. They knew she was searching, and now the whispers of distrust would multiply. The night stretched long and restless. Chau sat by her window, watching the rain turn the garden paths to silver ribbons. Thunder faded, replaced by the persistent ticking of the antique clock beside her bed. Holding the photo she dared to sneak from the study, hidden now in a secret fold of her pillowcase, she stared at the haunted faces in the picture, willing them to speak. Her thoughts raced. Was the debt, written on the back, literal or figurative? Did it involve money or something deeper? Guilt? Betrayal? Perhaps even a crime? Sleep would not come. Every creak of the mansion unsettled her. At midnight, as a gust rattled the windows, she heard hurried footsteps and hurried whispers in the hallway. The muffled exchange was tense, urgent. Pressing her ear to the door, she caught the tail end. "If she finds out, it will destroy everything." Chau's blood ran cold. She wondered who she was. Herself, or perhaps another woman before her who had tried to peer behind the family's veil. The sheer magnitude of what she might be uncovering began to dawn on her. Was this merely a matter of inheritance or something far darker? A wrong so impactful that its mere mention could shake the foundations of the Le family's power? The urge to run, to protect her children and retreat to the ordinary comfort of her old life, was overwhelming. But the weight of injustice, of being forced into submission, cast as an outsider, and silenced for the sake of reputation, fueled a deeper anger within her. Sometime after 2 a.m., Chau finally allowed exhaustion to overtake her. But even as she drifted into a shallow sleep, anxiety twisted her dreams. She saw the mansion's doors multiplying endlessly, each one half closed with shadowy figures beckoning or warning her away. In the garden, digging hands unearthed not gold or jewels, but secrets, letters torn in half, a child's forgotten shoe, a blood-stained handkerchief. Figures from the photograph appeared, faceless and accusing. Her heart pounded in her sleep. She woke with a start, sweat-soaked and gasping. She padded quietly to her children's room, needing reassurance. The sight of their innocent, sleeping faces made her decision for her. Whatever darkness festered in this family's past, she would not let it determine their future. She tucked the photo deeper beneath her pillow, resolved to face whatever confronted her next. As dawn painted pale stripes across the curtains, a final knock came at her door. It was Madame Li, her expression mask-like, but voice unnervingly gentle. "A word, dear. Let's discuss how to best uphold the family's image in the coming days. There is much at stake, do you understand?" There was no threat in her tone, but a world of warning in her gaze. Chau met her eyes, her own resolve cold and steady. She had seen what fear looked like, and she no longer wore it. By morning, the sleepless night had burned away her last hesitations. She emerged from behind her veiled existence not weaker, but tempered. The Inquisition, though harrowing, had given her clarity. She was not simply a guest in this house of secrets. She was its most dangerous question. The unveiling truth. For days after her sleepless night, Minh Chau found the world inside the Le Mansion even more stifling, as if every look and word were laced with suspicion. The glimpses of secrets, the photograph, whispers in the hallway, and the palpable tension among the household pressed on her mind, refusing to let her rest. Each encounter with her mother-in-law seemed to carry a new, silent warning. But instead of intimidating Chau, the family's vigilance fanned the flames of her determination. She resolved to find the truth, no matter the cost. At first, Chau tried to read between the lines of everyday life. Allegiances in the kitchen, the way older staff members averted their gaze when she entered a room, the nerves evident in even the most routine interactions. She began to realize that the family's power did not just reach into the city's upper crust, but also cast a shadow over those who worked for them, binding their loyalty with fear and ancient debts. Driven by a restless energy, Chau revisited the library and study whenever she could steal a moment alone. Late one evening, emboldened by the cover of Rain and Thunder, she attempted the delicate art of searching through drawers and cabinets, careful to leave every surface as she found it. In a rarely used cabinet behind a row of dusty law tomes, she discovered an old address book, its once rich leather worn and split at the corners. Slipped inside was a business card, yellowing and marked with an unfamiliar Saigon phone number. The name, Nguyen Van Quy, meant nothing to her, but it was followed by the faded word, witness. Her heart raced. The next morning, Chau locked herself in the upstairs bathroom under the pretense of being unwell and used her mobile phone to dial the number. A distinctly elderly voice, gruff and wary, answered. When Chau introduced herself and mentioned the Li family, there was a pause so long she thought the call had dropped. But then, The yes voice, this Nguyen, responded low and cautious. I told your father-in-law to let the past stay buried, but what's done is done. I won't talk over the phone. Too many ears. A mixture of fear and excitement filled her. Can I come see you? She whispered. The old man hesitated. Tomorrow, 4 o'clock, the old cafe by Gilded Park, and don't let anyone follow you. Chau was trembling as she hung up, not out of fear, but anticipation. She spent the next day in a fog, rehearsing explanations for where she would be when the time came. She feigned illness at lunch, drawing her mother-in-law's thinly veiled disdain, but winning sympathy from one of the more junior housekeepers. Distraction proved useful. That same housekeeper agreed to watch over Chau's children during her supposed afternoon rest. As the clock struck 3, Chau slipped away, blending into the rain-soaked streets beyond the mansion's iron gates. For the first time since her wedding, she felt truly alone, free from watchful eyes. She pulled her jacket tight against the drizzle and hailed a taxi, instructing the driver to circle twice before dropping her at Gilded Park, just in case she was followed. The cafe was small, the kind of place where nothing ever changed. Chrome chairs, chipped tile counters, and the faint aroma of overbrewed coffee. She found Nguyen Van Quy sitting near the window, his face ancient, eyes hidden behind thick, cloudy glasses. He looked her over and nodded for her to sit. Why do you want to know? He asked, his voice trembling more with memory than age. Chau hesitated. Because there's something rotten in that house, and my children will inherit it if I don't put a stop to it. He seemed to weigh her words before beginning. Many years ago, your father-in-law, he was a clever man but ruthless. There was another man, too, his cousin. They bought up land on the edge of town, chasing something big. They needed the land cheap, so they bribed officials, forced out families. Some refused to go. There was a fire, a mysterious one. People died. The land was cleared in the chaos, and the police looked the other way after being paid off. His hands shook slightly as he reached for his coffee cup. One of those families had a child. Disappeared that night. Official story was an accident, but many suspect the child was never truly lost, just erased. Chau sat, stunned. She realized the debt on the photograph was no mere financial burden, but a stain heavier than money, a legacy of guilt passed down in silence. And no one ever paid for this? She asked, voice barely above a whisper. Nguyen shook his head. Everything was covered up. A few of us tried, me, some neighbors. We were threatened. Some left the city. Some just kept our heads down. That's how these dynasties keep their power. Why tell me now? Chau pressed. Regret grows heavier with age. And perhaps because, after all, these years, you're the first to ask. They parted after sharing a brief, conspiratorial silence. Outside, dusk had settled, and the city's neon lights flickered awake. Back in her taxi, Chau felt a surge of indignation and protectiveness. Her family, her children, she had married into more than privilege. She had become the latest in a line bound to a secret so vile that even the staff feared to whisper its name. Returning to the mansion, she forced herself to walk calmly, hiding the shaking in her hands. The front doors loomed like a fortress. Madame Lee greeted her with a smile that hinted at suspicion, but not yet certainty. Chau retreated to her room, locked the door, and pulled the photograph from its hiding place. She finally understood the haunted faces frozen in the photo and the reason no one spoke of them. So many lives destroyed, her husband's fortune built on the ashes of the forgotten, the silenced. Yet the truth, now glimmering fiercely in her mind, brought clarity as never before. Chau was no longer just a guest, nor a pawn on the family's polished chessboard. For the first time, she held leverage, a weapon sharpened by secrets and grief. She slept little that night, planning her next move. Plans began to form in the early hours. How to gather proof, whom to trust, how to wield this newfound power to protect her children, and, perhaps, deliver justice for those lost so long ago. Dawn broke pale and thin, light reflecting in her eyes. She was changed. The truth, while laced with tragedy, was her first taste of true freedom. Tragedy repeats. Itself, the days following her discovery weighed on Minh Chau with suffocating inevitability. Now that she understood the truth between the walls, the La Mansion no longer felt like a mere prison. It was the scene of an unending pattern, a stage on which tragedy had already played out for generations, and was now preparing for a new act. The half-open doors had become more than a metaphor. They were warning signs, too late for some, possibly not too late for her and her children. Chau found that the subtle hostilities she had learned to endure were morphing into direct threats. It began with small, unmistakable changes. Her children returned from school with nervous glances, burdened by questions about family loyalty and, "Why don't you speak up more, Mother?" Gifts sent by her own side of the family were intercepted by staff before making it to her room. Madame Lee's controlling presence, always formidable, became nearly omnipresent. The older woman's tone in household meetings turned sharper, her scrutiny relentless. One humid morning, a silken envelope arrived at the breakfast table. Inside, a summons. The La family's solicitor was arranging an early review of the family trust and property division, years before anyone had expected it. The implication was unmistakable. Chau, and more specifically, her children, were about to be written out of the future if she didn't toe the line. The message was crystal clear in Madame Lee's icy smile. Comply or risk losing everything that gave her children security. Rumors spread through the mansion at the speed of whispered malice. Servants eyed Chau with mingled fear and pity. The sisters-in-law became openly competitive, parading their children's academic certificates and impeccable manners before the elders at each meal. Even Chau's husband, usually distant and preoccupied, changed. His phone calls grew briefer. He spent more evenings isolated in his father's old study, returning with a harder set to his jaw, as if steeling himself for a fight he neither wanted nor fully understood. The true crisis struck in the most private chamber of all, the question of her children's custody. Madame Lee, never one to deliver blows directly, instead called a family conference, ostensibly to discuss the children's schooling and well-being. The gathering was an ambush. Chau's every parental decision, from diet to discipline to after-school lessons, was dissected before an audience of family experts. The implication was clear. She was an outsider. Perhaps she loved them, but could she truly guarantee their future as only the Lee family blood could? Chau's world threatened to collapse. For days, she hardly slept, watching over her children as if her vigilance could keep the family's predatory ambitions at bay. Her son awoke one night in tears, having dreamed that his mother had vanished, leaving him alone with relatives whose faces blurred in and out of monstrous proportions. Her youngest daughter refused to eat, whispering that one of the aunties had said soon she would have to be brave without Mama. It became clear that the struggle was no longer about preserving her dignity. Something far deeper was at stake: the right to keep her family whole and her children safe from a legacy of tragedy. The house was closing in around her, every corridor echoing with memories of past victims, other brides, perhaps, who had entered with hopes, only to be ground down and forgotten. Chau grew desperate to protect her children, but the odds felt insurmountable. Her in-laws held every social and financial card. Outsiders, her own parents, old friends, had been quietly distanced, any attempts at support subtly repulsed. Alone at her dressing table late at night, she found herself gripped by dread. What if resistance only led to more suffering, as it had for those whose fates she was only beginning to uncover? Yet as the walls pressed in, something contrary and defiant sparked inside her, fed by the memory of the secrets she now possessed. The cycle need not play out again. Not if she could summon the will to break it. She recalled Nguyen Van Quie's words, the warning against silence and the reminder that, sometimes, the courage of a single person could tilt the balance for all who came after. Matters reached their peak in a meeting with the solicitor, attended by the whole family in the drawing room. The lawyer, impeccably dressed and perfectly smooth, presented a revised proposal for the division of assets and guardianship arrangements. The language was polite, but the conclusion was not. In case of incompatibility or a breach of family harmony, custody of Chau's two youngest children would revert to Madame Li, while her son's inheritance would be placed in trust until such time as the family deems fit. Chau felt her blood freeze. This was not an offer, but a threat, meant to coerce obedience or precipitate her banishment. Her husband offered her a weak, apologetic glance, but said nothing. The room was silent, filled with the perfume of lilies and the suffocating weight of family pride. She excused herself, retreating to the garden despite the storm clouds gathering overhead. As rain beaded on her skin, Chau gazed at the manicured lawn. The same ground, she realized, where so many of this family's secrets were buried. Her resolve solidified. The tragic stories of the past would not be repeated through her children. She would break the cycle, even if it cost her everything she owned. She returned indoors, her footsteps loud in the echoing marble hall, and locked herself in her room. That evening, as thunder rolled and lightning split the sky, Chau sat with her children and told them, in simple but truthful words, that they would always be loved and that, whatever happened, she would fight for them. It was a promise she intended to keep, carved deeper by the knowledge of the suffering that would follow if she failed. The stage was set for confrontation, but in her heart, Minh Chau had already made a choice. Tragedy might have repeated itself in this house for generations, but it would not do so with her silent consent. The night stretched before her, storm-lit and restless, but now she carried within her a purpose she could not have imagined when she first passed through the mansion's half-closed door. The counter-move night fell over the La Mansion like a velvet shroud heavy with expectation. Minh Chau, after weeks of suffering and silence, now moved through the halls with a clarity that bordered on defiance. No longer was she just a frightened outsider struggling for a place in the rigid hierarchy. She was a player, armed, at last, with a weapon the family feared more than scandal: the truth. Chau spent the morning after the thunderstorm laying careful plans. The stifling breakfast was charged with unspoken resentment, the remembrance of the previous evening's confrontation still fresh. Her mother-in-law caught her gaze with steely precision, but Chau didn't falter. She had been awake through the darkest hours, mapping the delicate steps of a counteroffensive. For once, she ate slowly, making her intentions transparent as she looked each member of the household in the eye. First, she needed allies, or at the very least, witnesses. Chau discreetly asked Mrs. Lin, the aging housekeeper whose loyalty had always hovered somewhere between fear and affection, to join her in the garden for a private conversation. The air was still and humid among the hydrangeas, a faint buzz of cicadas rising from unseen corners. "Mrs. Lin," Chau began, deliberately lowering her voice, "doesn't the truth weigh on you? This house has carried too many secrets for too long. If something happens to me or my children, Will you help make sure my side is heard?" The old woman's eyes darted nervously, but Chau saw a flicker of resolve stir in her wrinkled hands. "I will do what I can, madam," she whispered, and that was enough for Chau to continue. By noon, Chau had gathered not only her courage but evidence. She made copies of the photograph, Nguyen Van Quie's name and testimony, and her own written statement detailing what she had learned about the land, the fire, the missing child, and how the estate's fortune was rooted in loss and betrayal. She placed these in a sealed envelope, which she entrusted to Tuan, the loyal driver, along with explicit written instructions. If anything happened to her or her children, the packet was to be delivered not just to her own family, but the press as well. Her hands trembled slightly as she explained. "This is for my children's sake. Please, Tuan, protect them if you can. And remember, silence is no longer loyalty when innocent lives are at stake." Tuan nodded solemnly. "You have my word, madam. I have seen too much suffering here. I will deliver your message if you give the signal." Chau felt a glimmer of validation for the first time since entering the mansion. Armed with preparation, Chau asked for a meeting with Madame Li. The request was received like a chess player accepting a dangerous gambit. At the appointed hour, Chau entered the parlor, the walls lined with lacquered screens and ancestor portraits staring down like a jury. Madame Li sat, posture regal and unyielding, flanked by Chau's husband and the two sisters-in-law, all three radiating rehearsed poise. Chau was the first to speak, choosing her words with care. "I believe we all know this family's strength depends on its reputation and on unity, but both are at risk now." Her fingers brushed against the envelope in her lap. "There are things I have learned about how this fortune was built and about what happened to those who once stood in your way. If I am forced out, if anything happens to me or my children, what has been concealed for decades will become public. I have made sure of it." The room turned to stone. Madame Lei's eyes narrowed. "Are you threatening us, Chau?" "I am protecting my children," Chau replied, her voice both soft and unyielding. A sister-in-law snorted. "You would destroy all of this, for what? Old stories? Your pride?" "My children's future," Chau repeated, not wavering. "I do not want to shame this family. But you will not weaponize shame against me. These secrets are not just history. They continue to hurt the living. Me, my children, even the staff you claim to honor as part of your legacy." Silence pulsed in the room. The Li family patriarch, her husband, finally spoke, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. "What do you want, Chau?" It was her signal to negotiate. "My children stay with me. I am to have a say in their education and future. My own family is to be respected. No more intercepted letters, no more isolation. You will not tamper with the trust or force us out with legal maneuvers." She met each gaze in turn. "In exchange, what I know will remain where it is. I want peace and dignity for everyone. No exposés, no revenge. But if you push me again, none of us will be able to control the fallout." Madame Li leveled her steady gaze at Chau, searching for weakness, but all she found was resolve. Finally, the older woman nodded, a gesture as brittle as porcelain. "You're clever. I wondered when you would learn how this family really endures." Her approval was grudging but unmistakable, a recognition that Chau had claimed a place at the table that could not be taken by force. That afternoon, a new atmosphere settled over the mansion. A wary truce, neither victory nor defeat. The sisters-in-law, cowed by the possibility of disgrace, kept their distance. Chau's husband, perhaps for the first time, looked at her with something like respect tinged with regret. Behind the scenes, Mrs. Lin and Tuan became her quiet supporters. Servants who once averted their eyes now greeted her with a new, almost reverent deference. Yet Chau knew her victory was precarious. At dinner, every word was measured, every glance calculated. But something profound had changed. She, who had been the family's most vulnerable pawn, was now the most unpredictable piece on the board. Her silence was not submission. It was leverage. In her children's rooms that night, Chau felt a weight lift. Her children came to her one by one, seeking the comfort and truth only she could provide. She told them, without details they could not yet understand, that things would be different now, that honesty and courage matter more than fear. Alone before bed, Chau reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She wasn't seeking vengeance, and she didn't wish for the family to be destroyed. The real power, she understood now, did not lie in secrets, but in the willingness to break their hold. With a single countermove, she had shifted her fate, and perhaps, in time, the fate of those who would come after her through the half-closed doors of the Les Mansions. The line of justice. After the uneasy truce was struck, a smoldering tension lingered in the Les Mansion. Everyone sensed it, a current of foreboding, and no one more than Minh Chau. Each day, as sunlight dappled the garden paths, the youngest house staff whispered of a coming reckoning, while the older servants moved with haunted caution. The family, for all its outward perfection, had been rattled at the core. Madame Lay became restless, holding long, closed-door meetings with the patriarch and the family's lawyer, her measured voice carrying through the corridors late into the night. The sisters-in-law hovered in the background, oscillating between false camaraderie and overt suspicion when Chau entered a room. Even the children, perceptive in the way only the young can be, clung to Chau a little tighter. Chau saw the shadow in their eyes and promised herself, again and again, she would let nothing hurt them. Outside the mansion's high gates, rumors about the Lee family began to drift. Just whispers, but enough to trouble any dynasty whose reputation had always been its greatest armor. Servants reported strange men visiting after midnight. The family's driver mentioned being ordered to take roundabout routes, delivering parcels with no return address, then told never to speak of them. The family matriarch, terrified of losing face and wealth, started to see enemies in every reflection. It was soon clear to Chau that the Lay family's chief strategy was control over narrative, over assets, and most of all, over her. She spotted subtle hints. House records gone missing, her phone monitored, familiar faces among the staff quietly replaced by those unfriendly to her. One evening, as she reached for a letter from her father, she discovered it had been unsealed and clumsily retaped. A warning prickled along her spine. Yet for every quiet attack, Chau responded with patient resistance. She continued gathering evidence. Dates, documents, names, and memories still whispered by Mrs. Lin and sometimes by the gardener late at night when the windows were dark enough to make words safe. She updated the folder she had entrusted Tuan with, making it a living record, each new page a shield. The family's solicitor, sensing seismic change, asked to meet Chau privately. The meeting was held in the heavy, wood-paneled study, floor-to-ceiling books and a single staring ancestor's portrait looming above the desk. The solicitor, a man accustomed to intimidating with legalese, tried gentle persuasion. He spoke of legacy, of the pain scandal could cause her children, of how surely all of this could be resolved discreetly. Chau listened, her face a mask, then responded with a quiet assurance that discretion would only ever be mutual. Should the family force her hand, everything would come to light. Word of her stance traveled fast. Chau found herself more isolated, but not powerless. One afternoon, as she returned from the garden, she was cornered by her eldest sister-in-law. The woman hissed warnings cloaked as sisterly advice. "You will lose, you know. This house always wins. Where will you go if pushed out? Have you thought about your children's future? how hard their lives would be if you shame us all? Chau answered, her tone unwavering. I have thought about it more than you can imagine. What happens to them is in your hands as much as mine now. That night, the boundaries of justice, the line she would not cross, the wrong she would never ignore, became sharply defined in her heart. She realized she was no longer fighting only for herself, or even just for her children. She was standing up for every silent voice crushed by legacy, and for the principle that money and power do not entitle one to erase truth. Madame Lee sensed her resolve. The matriarch called an emergency family meeting, one that played out like a war council, each faction of the clan hunched over wine and nervously fingering prayer beads. The lawyer detailed the dangers: outside inquiry into the family's business, the risk of stories leaking to the news, the threat of the estate being divided if public shame ensued. A heated argument broke out, voices rising and falling beneath the chandelier's cold light. Chau watched, silent and unmoved, until her husband, the man who had once been her only bridge to this world, turned to her and said, "If you expose everything, you will destroy more than just our family. Is that what you want?" At that moment, Chau's patience broke. She stood. "What I want," she said, voice ringing through the hall, "is justice. Not revenge, not destruction for the sake of it, but an end to threats, to lies, to the cycle of pain. You have a choice. Atone, make amends, let the living move forward, or continue fighting the world and end up with nothing but ashes." A stunned silence pressed down, broken only by Madame Lee's trembling breath. "You cannot dictate to us," the old woman snapped, her command for once sounding desperate. "You think you are the first. I may not be the first, but I will be the last who lets you win through fear," Chau interrupted. "I have nothing left to bargain except the truth." The eldest sister-in-law, always a step behind in cruelty, spat out, "You are nothing without this family." Chau's eyes met hers, steady as stone. "I never was yours to keep," she said. The solicitor, perhaps sensing the winds of change too late, offered one final olive branch. "There is a way forward if all will commit." In the days that followed, the Lee family, faced with real exposure for the first time, grudgingly yielded. Documents were corrected. The trust was amended to reinstate Chau's children. Keys and correspondence were returned to her. Most importantly, she was granted full autonomy in her children's lives without conditions. Outside, the city hummed unaware, but inside the mansion, justice, however imperfect, had begun to draw its line. For the first time, the specter of the past loosened its grip. Chau walked the corridors lighter, not out of triumph, but certainty. She had demanded and won the essential right to protect, to speak, to exist on her own terms. From that day forward, silence was no longer the price of survival. For Minh Chau and her children, justice was not a victory over the family, but for themselves, and perhaps for all who would pass through those shadowed doors after her. Light at the end of the tunnel. The news of the Lee family's fall from grace spread through the city with the hushed excitement of a long-awaited storm finally released. Not in a single explosive headline, but in a series of murmurs, silent acknowledgments, and knowing glances from Saigon's old elite. The mansion that once stood as a fortress of untouchable reputation now seemed more like a gilded cage left open for judgment and the heavy winds of change. Inside, the silence was no longer full of threat, but of reckoning, the kind that lingers after the truth is spoken aloud and cannot be unspoken. Family portraits were discreetly removed from the foyer. Letters from old business partners went unanswered or were returned unopened. Madame Le, her once proud carriage diminished, spent her days confined to sitting rooms and sunless corners, receiving few visitors and speaking even less. Her power, so long rooted in secrets and appearances, was broken. Minh Chau watched the transformation with a mix of sorrow and relief. She understood that justice, even when necessary, left casualties in its wake. Lost friendships, broken dreams, even pity for a mother-in-law who had only ever wielded control as her shield. Yet Chau felt lighter, as if some invisible chain had finally snapped. The house that once suffocated her now seemed only a place, stripped of its shadows. The doors, real and metaphorical, could finally be closed or opened by her own choosing. She devoted her energy first to her children. Each day brought new small victories, a renewed appetite in her youngest daughter, who smiled more often now at breakfast, and the quiet confidence returning to her son's voice as he chattered eagerly about class projects and playground games. If scars lingered, Chau was determined to make them a source of strength. She encouraged the children to be proud of their roots, but not to be defined by the legacy of silence and conformity. She told them stories from her childhood, laughter echoing softly in the kitchen, dispelling the mansion's old gloom. As news of the family's diminished social standing made its way through the city, many so-called friends quietly disappeared. Yet Chau did not waste time grieving those losses. Instead, she found support in unlikely places. Among the staff whose loyalty had survived not out of fear, but respect, and in the tentative letters from her own parents, filled with relief and pride that she had reclaimed her voice at last. Her relationship with her husband, once marked by distance and resignation, changed as well. In the first days after the revelations, he kept mostly to himself, wandering the expansive gardens at dusk, perhaps mourning what his family had lost. But little by little, he began to meet Chau's gaze. There were awkward, halting conversations, apologies not always spoken aloud, but present in the softening of his tone, the shared glances over their children's accomplishments. The wounds between them would not heal overnight, Chau knew, but the possibility of honesty, however painful, had entered their lives at last. With her newly won autonomy, Chau took on the affairs once managed in secret by others. She oversaw her children's education herself, consulted directly with teachers, and chose activities that encouraged not only discipline, but independence. She quietly sold off jewelry and trinkets associated with the family's legacy, and donated to charities aimed at supporting women's legal rights, determined that no one else should ever feel as trapped and voiceless as she once had. The city beyond the mansion's walls seemed brighter, more accessible. For the first time in years, Chau strolled with her children in bustling parks, browsed markets without the anxious eyes of servants behind her, and even attended community events where she was greeted for who she was, not who she married. Sometimes other women approached her, voices low but full of hope, asking how she had dared to confront what everyone else accepted in silence. Chau did not call herself a hero, but she realized her very survival, her refusal to break, was already an inspiration. Privately, she reflected on her journey, the nights spent weeping on cold marble floors, the terror as the family closed ranks around her, the shivers of fear at every suspicious glance. What she once thought of as weakness or shame had, in the end, been her greatest source of power. Her pain was real, but she transformed it, step by slow step, into wisdom and determination. One rainy afternoon, Chau stood alone in the garden, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and blooming jasmine. The mansion, with all its history, loomed behind her. For a brief moment, memories threatened to overwhelm her. The whispered threats, the stares, the unrelenting pressure to be small and silent. But she exhaled, slow and steady, and felt peace instead. She was no longer a pawn moved across someone else's board, but the writer of her own story. The cycle of tragedy had been broken, not just for her, but she hoped for every daughter and daughter-in-law who would follow. As dusk fell, she called to her children from the balcony, her voice ringing with newfound confidence. They came running, laughter carrying across the flagstones and into the gathering night. Together, they lingered at the threshold. For the first time, Minh Chau felt that the light at the end of the tunnel was not just an illusion, but a promise fulfilled. And so, in the wake of one family's downfall and her own remarkable transformation, Chau saw clearly. Strength was not measured by domination, power, or even victory. True strength was the ability to speak, to endure, to change, and above all, to love without fear. The final chapter of autonomy. The months after the Lee family's downfall unraveled slowly, like an old, tightly wound scroll. In that time, Minh Chau began, for the first time in memory, to write the story of her own life with her own steady hands. The mansion's echoing corridors no longer inspired fear or submission in Chau. Instead, they became background scenery to a new set of rituals, ones of her choosing, shaped by patience, care, and a stubborn dignity. She created a space for her children that was neither palace nor prison, but a home filled with warmth, and the subtle music of laughter returned. Every corner of her day was different now. The subtle anxieties, wondering what had been said behind her back, fearing for the future of her children, weighing every word for hidden barbs, were replaced by simple, earnest concerns. What dish might cheer her son after a difficult exam? Which books might ignite her daughter's curiosity? How best to revive family traditions that once gave her solace, reimagined for a freer future? Though severed from the authority that once ruled over her, Chau was not tempted by bitterness. She understood too well that freedom purchased in blood and heartbreak was best honored by forgiveness for herself and even for those who once sought to silence her. She visited Madame Lay, now a shadow of the formidable matriarch she used to be. Together, they sipped tea in awkward silence. Finally, Chau broke it. "The past will haunt you only if you let it. Let's choose peace, while we can still shape what's left." The words were not offered in triumph, but in compassion. Her children flourished, brighter, bolder, growing into their own voices. They began to invite friends, filling the house with unfamiliar shoes and excited chatter. The staff, freed from the tyranny of constant surveillance and family feuds, found new pride in their work and in serving a household that radiated mutual respect. At night, in the once lonely halls, Chau took up old hobbies, tending a garden, writing letters to her distant siblings, archiving family photos with gentle commentaries scribbled on the backs. Even her husband, at first a stranger within his own home, seemed changed. Their relationship, stricken by so many years of miscommunication and loyalty to duty over love, thawed with difficulty. But they spoke now honestly, sometimes clumsily, sometimes with tears, but always searching for a new foundation, built not on secrecy, but mutual understanding. Chau reflected often on what power really meant. When she was young, she believed it lay in wealth, in titles, or in being admired. Now she knew better. True power was the right and courage to make her own decisions, to nurture kindness even where it was not returned, and to defend those who could not defend themselves. The La family's legacy, so carefully guarded for generations, had failed to protect happiness or integrity. Chau wanted something different for her children, a legacy of resilience. Yes, but one tempered by humility and empathy. She explored forgiveness even further, reaching out to estranged friends and, where possible, those among her in-laws who were also victims of the old order. Some overtures were accepted with gratitude, others rebuffed by lingering pride, but Chau pressed forward without expectations or regrets. She learned to see nuances, the complexities behind every act of cruelty, each born more from fear of losing control than from true malice. The city, too, regarded Chau with new respect. Women's groups invited her to speak, not as the gossip-shrouded survivor of a scandal, but as a quietly determined champion of autonomy. She declined most invitations, preferring to work behind the scenes, funding scholarships for girls, supporting legal advisors for wives in distress, and opening her home as a haven for those who needed a gentle refuge, even for a night. Despite outward victories, Chau's journey was not without ongoing trials. There were setbacks, a court appeal from a vindictive cousin, teachers prejudiced by the family name, whispered rumors still circling social circles. Sometimes, in quiet hours, she questioned whether her strength would hold. But instead of isolating herself, Chau gradually let her community, her truest friends, the loyal staff, and above all her children, be her support. Spring arrived, and with it, the gardens burst into color. For the first time, Chau held a party not dictated by obligation but by joy. A gathering of children, neighbors, teachers, and staff. Under lanterns strung from old trees, laughter rose like birdsong. She watched her children, running and gleaming under the lights, and smiled at her own parents across the courtyard, their eyes crinkled with relief that their daughter had come so far. That evening, as dusk fell and the party guests wandered home, Chau lingered alone on the steps. As she watched the last lantern swing gently in the breeze, she allowed herself to mourn. For years she had lost, for innocence taken, for loved ones estranged by the cost of truth. But above all, she allowed herself to hope. Chau wrote in her journal, "To choose one's own path is the rarest fortune. The real inheritance I want to leave. Teach my children the worth of compassion, the necessity of courage, and the freedom that can only be earned by facing down fear. Power, after all, means nothing without the wisdom to use it with kindness." In time, the La Mansion regained its grandeur, not through secrecy, but through forgiveness and new traditions. Doors once kept half-closed were thrown wide open. No secrets lingered in the dark. The past, with all its pain, did not disappear, but it lost its power to dictate the future. And so, with steady heart and clear eyes, Minh Chau welcomed the next dawn, not as a pawn of others' designs, but as the architect of her own fate. The final act of her story was not revenge, nor exile, nor grand gesture. It was the everyday liberty to live, to parent, and to love on her own terms. At last, the story of tragedy and silence had yielded to one of agency and hope, a final chapter of autonomy, not only for Chau and her children, but for every soul who might someday dare to walk through a half-closed door, seeking the light beyond.